Hello everyone! It's time for the finale, the conclusion, the ending of Password to Larkspur Lane. Woo! Sorry that I have been late. I've had to deal with finals this past week. So I'm finally relaxed and free, kind of. I'm actually packing to move to my new apartment, which will be in a couple of months. Woo! But anyway, you're not here for that. So, time for some more reading. Last time, Nancy was planning to break into the facility. And, it's a crazy plan. She's dressed up as this supposed older lady who was supposed to arrive on the day that Nancy arrived. But it's not really a good plan, though, to be honest. Because Nancy has no idea. Did Nancy even have any idea of when that older lady was supposed to arrive? I don't know. But point is, she's disguised as this lady. Bess is that's it described. She's dressed as this old lady. Bess is dressed as the nurse. So that's it. And so we have a dun 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 moment when Bess uses the password, because the password could have changed. So Nancy's like, oh crap, this is the moment of truth. This is the moment of truth. So anyway, let us get into the story. Chapter 16, Sleuthing. Singing horses, repeated the guard. Right you are. Striding up to the gates, he opened them wide. Bess guided the car between the posts, and the portals clanged shut. The password had permitted them to enter. Both girls heaved sighs of relief as they sped up the gravel driveway. Halfway to the mansion, Nancy spoke. Stop. No one can see us from the house yet, and the lodge is concealed by those shrubs. Bess brought the car to a halt, and Nancy said, back the car off the drive into that clump of trees, Bess. Good. Lucky there's enough room. Get in as far as you can. Keep on backing. Farther. That's fine. Now, you wait here. I'll return as soon as I can. Don't be too long, said Bess, trying not to sound frightened. Nancy squeezed her friend's hand and slipped out of the car. As she went up the hill, she could hear the dog down at the gatehouse growling. I hope he's still chained, she thought. Near the mansion, Nancy assumed a stooped posture and an uncertain walk. I must be on my guard, she told herself. Light streamed out onto the lawn from the windows of the house. Staying in the shadows, Nancy reached the walls of the mansion and made her way around to the back where she found an open door. Peering through the screen, she saw a wide, dimly lighted hallway with stairs ascending to her left, and guessed that this was a back door to the main corridor. She tested the screen. It was unlatched. Now for a trip inside, she murmured. I hope my new shoes don't squeak. Never underestimate a good pair of sneakers. Quietly, she stepped into the hall. Half a dozen wheelchairs stood about. 2 of them had sleeping occupants, but there was no other sign of life. Nancy moved on tiptoe toward the broad stairway and had just reached the steps when she heard the tread of feet on the oaken floor. In a flash, she darted to an empty wheelchair and muffled herself in the light. Muffled is a weird word to use in this context. But anyway, muffled herself in the light woolen blanket left by its last occupant. I'll try to look as if I'm asleep, she thought. At that moment, a young woman in a striped uniform entered the hall. Nancy watched her apprehensively, fearing that the hat and veil would excite some comment. The nurse's helper, however, marched by, humming to herself, giving none of the chairs a second glance. As soon as she disappeared through a door, Nancy leaped up and dashed toward the stairs. A white head poked up from the nearest chair, and a cracked voice cried, Hi there, my dear! The doctor seems to have more than cured you. Why, you young again! Nancy did not pause, but with hammering heart ran up the steps to the second floor. She quickly glanced around, then started the climb to the next story. At the top of the stairs, she peered cautiously down the corridor. Empty. Relieved, Nancy tried to get her bearings. The south corner room, Mrs. Eldridge had said. That will be to my right. You know what? I don't think Mrs. Eldridge said that. I'm pretty sure she didn't say that. So that's Nancy's voice right there. That would be to my right. Quickly, Nancy tipped down the hall and stopped before the last door. She bent to look through the keyhole but could see nothing. Then she turned the knob. The door was locked. As Nancy racked her brains to think of a way to open it, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She darted across the hall and tried the handle of the opposite door. It turned, and she stumbled into total darkness. It was not a room, but a small broom closet. It was a tight squeeze. Nancy did not dare move, for in the brief moment that the closet door was open, she had seen that the floor was filled with pails. Against the wall were mops, brooms, and other cleaning equipment. Her slightest movement would send them clattering to the floor. With her ear to the door, Nancy waited. The footsteps approached, coming her way. They stopped outside her hiding place. For an instant, she dared not breathe. Then there was the rattle of a key in a lock and the clink of china on a tray. Whew! You know how bad it would be if somebody wanted to go to that specific closet for cleaning supplies? Nancy would be screwed. Nancy guessed that a bedtime snack was being brought to Mrs. Eldridge. Cautiously, she opened the door and saw a white skirt vanish into Mrs. Eldridge's room. Then came Miss Tyson's harsh voice. Wake up, Mrs. Eldridge. Here's your medicine and some food. If you don't do as the doctor says, it will be the last snack you'll taste for a long time. The patient groaned faintly, and the nurse went on speaking. I have some nice hot consomme and toast and rice pudding. Doesn't that make your mouth water? Taste it. And remember that tomorrow there will be only stale bread and warm water for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if you don't obey your dear good Dr. Bell, who is so kind to you. An idea suddenly occurred to Nancy. If that nurse is going to lecture Mrs. Eldridge, I'll have some time to act, she decided. Swiftly, Nancy tore a strip from her veil and slipped out of the closet to the opposite door. It stood slightly ajar. With the piece of net, Nancy plugged the slot in the door frame into which the bolt of the spring lock fitted. Then she darted back to her hiding place. I hope my scheme works, she thought. As Nancy stepped back and pulled the door shut, she bumped against a broom. The handle fell forward. Quickly, Nancy caught it in another room which toppled. For a moment, she clutched the wooden handles in the dark, her heart pounding. Then, very cautiously, Nancy propped them against the wall again. Oh, that's all I need, she murmured. One noise and I'll be trapped. Miss Tyson remained to threaten Mrs. Eldridge a few minutes more, then left the room. She closed the door and, apparently thinking it was locked, hurried away. Nancy listened for her to go downstairs, then ran to the door across the hall. Her trick had worked. The bolt had failed to lock. Nancy pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Mrs. Eldridge, she said softly. The old lady was propped up in bed with 2 pillows behind her back, contemplating her bedtime snack. With a sigh, she pushed aside the tray on her lap. Mrs. Eldridge, Nancy whispered again, coming closer to the elderly woman. The patient looked up and gave a sharp scream. Nancy flew to her side. Don't be afraid, it's Nancy Drew, the girl who spoke to you through the fence, she whispered, quickly lifting the veil. I'm sorry, I'm nervous, the old woman gasped. They've tried their best to frighten me so often. How in the world did you get in? Don't worry about that. The thing to do now is for you to get out of here. I hope no one heard you scream. But as she spoke, she heard someone running down the hall. I heard Mrs. Eldridge scream, came Miss Tyson's voice. What of it? Said a second speaker. I suppose I'll have to chase into her room again, the nurse said irritably. I wouldn't bother, came another voice. But I can't let anything happen to her, said the nurse. She hasn't signed yet? No. Oh, by the way, I have noticed that I've been followed. Mincy Perlict 1986, assuming that you are not a bot. Thank you for the follow. Nancy looked around the room. There's not even a closed closet to hide in. Mrs. Eldridge groaned. Oh, child, what will you do? As the doorknob turned, Nancy dived under the bed. It was very dusty there, and she lay motionless, almost afraid to breathe. Nancy could see a pair of white leather-shod feet stride into the room and pause at the foot of the bed a few inches from her nose. You screamed, Miss Tyson said angrily. Why, Mrs. Eldridge? Oh, did I? The patient asked in a weak voice. I am so sorry. Whether you are sorry or not makes no difference, Miss Tyson snapped. There are other patients in the house whom you upset by carrying on that way. Why did you scream? I am really very sorry, Mrs. Eldridge said, trying to find some excuse for her outcry. It won't happen again. I asked you why, the nurse said sharply. There was no reply. Answer my question, exclaimed the nurse, stamping her foot and raising a cloud of dust. Nancy pressed the hat veil to her face, trying not to squeeze. Trying not to squeeze her nose. The consomme is very hot, Mrs. Eldridge said. I burned my tongue. I know that this is a stressful situation, but Mrs. Eldridge, really? You couldn't say, like, you imagined something? That's the best way to, like, in a kidnapping situation. Like, I imagined something. Or, I'm wasting your time on purpose. A likely story, the nurse sniffed. The broth is not as hot as all that after being carried up from the kitchen. No, that is not the truth, Mrs. Eldridge, and I intend to find out your real reason. Oh, Miss Tyson, begged the patient, don't scold me. I had to make a special trip up here on your account. That's too bad. I'm sorry. Well, why did you scream? What have you been doing? Rasped the nurse. Nothing, replied the old lady. I haven't been out of bed. You've been acting funny ever since this afternoon. You're up to something. And the nurse added in a bullying tone. I don't even know what's a bullying tone, but okay. Do you know what I'm going to do? What? Asked Mrs. Eldridge. Search this room. Dun, dun, dun! If that happens, Nancy is going to be found out. What will she do? Chapter 17, Attic Hideout. At the nurse's words, Nancy froze in horror. From her hiding place under the bed, she strained to hear the old woman's reply. Well, go ahead and search, quavered Mrs. Eldridge. What do I care? You spunky old dear, Nancy thought. The nurse snorted. Guess it would be a waste of time. Things are beginning to get on my nerves. You especially. I'm sorry, Mrs. Eldridge said meekly. I think you screamed just to make trouble, snapped the nurse. Because you know another patient is due here and you want to give the place a bad reputation. Well, spare yourself the trouble. The new patient's nurse just telephoned that she will not arrive today. Nancy nearly groaned. If someone questions the gatekeeper, I'm sunk, she thought. I must get Mrs. Eldridge out of here quickly. You were screwed either way, Nancy. Like, did you even know what time... Like, I forget. But did you even know what time that person was supposed to arrive? I'll give you 5 minutes to eat. Then it'll be 9 o'clock. 0 hour for you, old girl. With an ugly laugh, the nurse stamped out of the room. Nancy waited until the sound of her footsteps had died away before she crept from her hiding place. Hastily, she brushed the dust from her black clothing. You are wonderful, Mrs. Eldridge, she whispered. Now we must work fast and quietly. Can you walk? Yes. They keep us confined to wheelchairs to weaken us, but I'm still pretty spry. I walk up and down this room for a little exercise. Once I tried to climb out of a ground floor window, but the vines pulled loose and I fell and dislocated my shoulder. From the 2nd floor. Wow. 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 This is Nancy grown up. Although I don't think Nancy would put herself in this position. But that's totally Nancy when she's older. I'm locked in this room. I'm gonna climb out this window. Is that how it happened? Nancy marveled at the elderly woman's courage. I mean, seriously. When you're older and you fall, it could actually have some serious consequences to your health. It could kill you. So be careful, kiddos, when you reach old age. While Mrs. Eldridge talked, Nancy had taken off her long coat, hat, and gloves. Now she helped the woman to put on her own shoes and Nancy's costume. As she did so, the excited old lady looked at the supper tray. Food is cooked with drugs to keep us drowsy all the time, she said. I eat as little of it as possible. How dreadful, Nancy murmured as she helped her to the door. Don't take the main stairs, Mrs. Aldridge whispered. There's a service flight at the rear end of the hall. Are you sure? Nancy asked. Yes, I explored this place in the dark until they took to locking me in at night. By the way, how could you open my door? I'll tell you later, said Nancy. Come now. The service stairway was a steep flight of enclosed steps which Mrs. Eldridge had to go down sideways one at a time. With maddening slowness, they reached the second floor and saw lights reflected under the door leading to the hall. The stairs squeaked and Nancy's nerves grew tenser. Near the ground floor, the staircase divided and Mrs. Eldridge said they should take the left branch. The others lead into the kitchen. This one takes you to the cellar landing and the entrance into the garden, she whispered. A few minutes later, they stepped into the open air. As fast as Mrs. Eldridge could go, the two hastened to the car. Nancy's heart leaped with joy when she saw its hulking shadow among the trees. Bess, she whispered, any trouble? No, but I thought he'd never come. Bess choked back tears of relief as she and Nancy helped Mrs. Eldridge into the back of the car. You'll have to sit on the floor and keep your head down, Nancy warned Mrs. Eldridge. Go now, Bess. Good luck. Oh, Nancy, aren't you coming? Bess whispered. No, I have work to do here. Well, for goodness sake, be careful. Don't ever say that C word. Careful always lands Nancy into trouble. Because she's not careful. And when you say that word, she just gets into even more danger. You think I'm kidding. I'm not. Every time, Nancy gets into trouble. So it's like, be careful as a jinx. The car moved out of the shadows to the driveway. Nancy followed and watched the red taillights proceed toward the closed gate. Oh, I hope there'll be no trouble, she thought. The watchman came out with a flashlight and shone it into Bess's window as she stopped. The dog began to bark frantically. For what seemed an age, the gatekeeper held the light in Bess's face, and Nancy heard him talking, but could not make out the words. What was the trouble? At last he shrugged, opened the gate, and the car shot through. As the red taillights disappeared down the lane, Nancy gave a sigh of relief. Now to send Ned the alarm. As she turned back toward the house, Nancy saw that it was ablaze with lights. Figures darted back and forth across the illumined windows. Reaching the mansion, Nancy concealed herself in the shrubbery along the foundation. A window above her was suddenly flung open, and Belle's voice rang out. Emily, your carelessness is inexcusable, he thundered. I am not afraid of the old crone's escaping, but she will give us a pretty hour's work searching the grounds. Listen, Simon, Mrs. Tyson replied. I can't be everywhere at once. You can keep your eyes open, he snapped. Mrs. Eldridge smuggled her bracelet to that doctor right under your nose. Forget it, the woman retorted. You've taken in enough money on these old women. Why don't you quit this business? Then we could all leave for South America as you promised. Not with several $1,000s still to be had, Belle snarled. See that every shrub and bush in this place is combed for Mrs. Eldridge, and when you find her, bring her to me. All right. We will wring the money out of her tonight. Nancy peered upward. She could see Belle's pointed beard thrust from the window. Suppose he saw her. But after a few moments, he withdrew his head. So they are searching the grounds, Nancy mused. In that case, Mrs. Eldridge's room would be the safest place for me. The Great Dane growled menacingly at the gatehouse. Nancy shivered. Suppose they let him loose. She edged softly to the rear door by which she and the elderly woman had left and crept up the steep, dark stairs. When she was halfway to the third story, the door below her was thrown open, and a voice asked, Has anyone looked in here? As light streamed into the stairway, Nancy ran on tiptoe to the top. I'll check the third floor, the same woman said. As she started upward, Nancy whirled and quietly sprinted up the narrow stairs, 2 steps in 1 leap. At the top was a low door. The young detective opened it, stepped into blackness, and closed the door softly behind her. From the mustiness, she surmised that it was an attic. For a few moments, she listened. Silence. Then came a scurrying noise and a squeak. Mice! Nancy felt along the wall until her fingers found a switch. She flicked it on, and a single bulb lighted in the middle of a great raftered room. Here and there stood trunks, barrels, and old furniture. Against one wall rested dozens of dismantled bedsteads. In the middle, a ladder led up to rafters, and there Nancy could see a partial floor with boxes and piles of newspapers. Suddenly she noticed a small round window at one end of the attic. With a gasp, Nancy quickly flicked off the light, hoping no one had seen it from the grounds. She felt her way to the window and looked down. Several flashlights were moving near the outbuildings. "That's where I'll have to go," she said to herself. "In order to send the alarm to Ned, I must read the pigeon loft unseen. I must reach the pigeon loft unseen." Just then she heard a low sigh behind her in the dark attic. It seemed to come from above. Who could be hiding here? Or maybe it's a prisoner. Morgan, she thought. Oh, now you remember Morgan. So this is where they're keeping him. Nancy felt her way back to the ladder and cautiously climbed part way up. "Morgan?" she whispered. There was a gasp. "Yes? Who is it?" "Nancy Drew, are you well enough to move?" "No," was the faint reply. "I'm weak." Nancy's heart sank. "Never mind," she said encouragingly. "I'm going to get you out of here somehow, just—" At that moment, footsteps clumped up on the attic stairs. Nancy scampered up the ladder and fell among the boxes of papers. Just as she crouched down, the light went on. From a cramped position, she saw that Morgan, very pale, lay on a mattress, well concealed amid the boxes. Scattered at her feet were bits of torn newspaper. Peering between boxes, she saw two men at the door. One had a thin, pinched face, the other was stout with pale, flabby features. The big man was puffing. "There's nobody here, Tar. All those stairs for nothing." Chief said he saw a light. "Chief's wrong." The other man sighed. "You better search anyway." Very cautiously, Nancy tried to relieve her cramped muscles. But just as they walked beneath the platform, her foot slipped, pushing a small piece of paper off the platform. As it fluttered down, the two men looked up. "Morgan!" Tar called sharply. "You alone?" The sick man groaned slightly. "Forget it," said Jackson. "There's nobody with him. Probably a mouse disturbed the paper. Place is full of them." "We ought to search," the thin man said weakly. Weakly. The heavy one grinned craftily. "Let's not and say we did." The other gave a weak laugh, and they left, flickering out the light. "I'll be back soon, Morgan," Nancy promised. As quickly as possible, she made her way out of the attic down to the third floor. "I'll wait in Mrs. Eldridge's room," Nancy decided. "When I hear the searchers come inside, I'll sneak out to the pigeon loft." Softly, she turned the knob and stepped into the upper hall. A startled scream rang out. Oh, help!" The crash of crockery froze Nancy in her tracks. The nurse's helper was in the hallway, staring at Nancy open-mouthed, a tray of broken dishes at her feet. Nancy darted past her and ran down the main stairs, while behind her she heard the girl shouting the alarm. A chorus of excited voices came from the second floor, but Nancy reached the veranda without being seen. She ran along its entire length and jumped into the shrubbery, panting. Then, hoping that she would not be seen, Nancy darted across the open lawn to a clump of bushes. A moment later, her heart leaped with alarm. Somewhere nearby, she heard the dog sniffing. The next instant, the animal broke into frantic barking. Heavy footsteps raced up, and a blinding light focused on Nancy's face. "Here she is," a deep voice shouted. "I got her, Chief." Seriously, she could have just waited up in the attic. You know, they already, were there. They didn't see Mrs. Eldridge there. So. But yep, Nancy's been caught. Chapter 18, The Underground Cell. More running steps came closer and stopped outside the bushes. "Come out of there," ordered a harsh voice. Nancy's heart sank. The speaker was Adam Thorne. Nancy, knowing resistance was futile, she crept from the brush and stood up in the glare of a powerful flashlight. In the darkness just beyond, Nancy could hear the dog snarling and her captors breathing heavily. "It isn't the old lady," came Mrs. Tyson's voice. "It's Nancy Drew." Adam Thorne growled. "What? I thought we knocked her out of action." Miss Tyson said in a worried voice, "That's what Tar and Jackson reported. Tar himself pushed her." "Quiet," snapped Thorne. "She's tricked us. Take her to the house. We'll lock her up." Quick as lightning, Nancy plunged out of the light and desperately raced down the hill. Taken by surprise, her captors hesitated, then pounded after her, the dog barking furiously. Blinded by the sudden change from light to darkness, Nancy stumbled and fell. An instant later, the Great Dane leaped on her. "Grab that leash!" shouted Thorn. The dog was yanked back, then someone jerked Nancy to her feet. "Well, take her to the house," panted Thorn. With the escalator in the lead, flanked by the nurse and the attendant, and guarded in the rear by the gatekeeper and his dog, Nancy was marched to the mansion. Bell was waiting in the maid hall. "Who is this?" he demanded. "Where's Mrs. Eldridge?" "We haven't found that old fox yet," Thorn answered. "This is the Drew girl I warned you about." Bell's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by trespassing on private property?" "I meant no harm," Nancy replied truthfully. Thorn snorted scornfully. "She's been spying. It's your fault, Belle. I told you not to bring Dr. Spire here. If the old woman's shoulder was dislocated, you should have let it stay that way. Too bad you aren't a real doctor," he added unpleasantly. "You could have said it yourself." "Never mind that," Miss Tyson put in sharply. "How did she get in here?" "Luther, bring the gatekeeper quickly," Belle ordered. "Just how did you get in, Miss Drew?" "I came in at the entrance," Nancy replied. "The larkspur is beautiful." "I'm not interested in flowers. I think—" Bell checked himself. He turned to Adam Thorne and spoke in an undertone, but Nancy, straining her ears, heard him say, "Password to Larkspur Lane," before their voices became hushed. After a few minutes, the attendant appeared with the gateman. "Jones, have you ever seen this young woman?" Bell demanded, glaring at the man standing before him. "I? No, sir," the guard declared, not recognizing Nancy dressed in her own clothes. "Did anybody come in by the gate tonight?" Bell asked sharply. Nancy saw fear flicker in the man's eyes as he met Bell's hard stare. Through no fault of his own, the gateman had let intruders into the grounds. Jones swallowed. "No, Chief," he said. "Nobody came in or out." Thank goodness for someone who wants to save their own skin. A wave of relief swept over Nancy. No alarm would go out for Mrs. Eldridge. The gang would continue to think she was hiding on the grounds. By the way, can we say that Nancy is the queen of convenience again? Nancy is the queen of convenience! "All right," Bell said. "Get back to the gate." Then turning to Thorne, he said, "Let's continue this in my office." Excuse me. Miss Tyson grinned maliciously as she prodded Nancy along and into a large, luxurious room. A thick green carpet covered the floor, and in the center stood a large mahogany desk. The walls, paneled in a rich-looking wood, were hung with costly oil paintings. "Shut the door, Luther," Bell ordered. Bell seated himself behind the desk, motioning Nancy to stand opposite him. There was tense silence for a moment. Then Bell reached for a desk telephone. I am going to call the police, Miss Drew, and turn you over to them on a charge of trespassing, breaking and entering with attempt to steal." "I wish you would," Nancy replied, "if it is possible over that dummy telephone." "Didn't I tell you she was sharp-eyed?" Thorne scolded. "You can't fool her. Follow my advice and put her away. This is a waste of time." "What do you mean? Do you wish to have me summon the police?" Bell blustered. "Why do you call this a dummy telephone?" "Because, in answer to your first question, I should be happy to be escorted from here under police protection," Nancy retorted. "I know the telephone is a dummy because there are no—" She checked herself abruptly. No use proving her powers of observation. "See here, Nancy Drew," Bell said, pointing a finger at her. "Stop all this talk and tell me how you entered these grounds, and why. I know all about you. Sylvan Lake is a long distance from here, and you do not walk." "There are various ways of traveling." That's a good response. "Belle, I'm telling you, it's just foolishness to try to match wits with this girl," Thorne put in. "I know a way to make her talk, and what's more, I'm sure her illustrious father will pay plenty to get his precious daughter back." "An excellent idea, Thorne," Belle said with an evil smile. "What would you suggest we do first?" "Put her in the cistern," said Thorne. "I guess a couple of days without food or drink down in the dark and cold with the rats and spiders will make Miss Drew answer any question we ask." Miss Tyson laughed harshly, looking straight at Nancy to see if she winced at the prospect. "That will take some of the snap out of her," she said. A shiver went down Nancy's spine, but she did not change expression. Bell's cold eyes studied her carefully. "You caused us a lot of trouble," he said softly. "Because of you, we had to give up our other other headquarters. My partner, Mr. Tooker, will not overlook that very readily. Bell toyed with a sharp-pointed letter opener on his desk. Miss Tyson spoke up. The pigeon keeper guessed she had found that bird, kept it, and then followed it to Tooker's. Now I'm sure he was right. Only from the message that pigeon carried could she have learned the password, and I still say she couldn't have entered without it. Luther cleared his throat. But Jones said... He was lying, Miss Tyson broke in. Where's the car you came in? She asked Nancy. Nancy thought it best to keep stalling. The farther away Bess, George, and Mrs. Eldridge got, the safer they would be. Nancy smiled. Why don't you search the grounds for the car? That's enough, snapped Belle. Take her away. Nancy knew she was in a hopeless predicament, and reasoned that more was to be gained by strategy than by a desperate attempt to break loose. As she was marched out of the room, she heard Belle say, The disappearance of the Eldridge woman and the Drew girl showing up have me so upset I can't think. I'm going upstairs and tell Dolph. Let him handle this. It's dynamite. Do as you please, Thorne said coldly. Nancy, her arms pinned behind her back, was shoved out onto the porch and toward the buildings beyond the house. Just outside the pigeon loft, Thorne stooped and jerked at an iron ring in the ground. It was attached to a round steel lid about 3 feet in diameter. Beneath it gaped a black hole. Well, down you go, Nancy Drew, Thorne laughed. Nancy looked around desperately. There was no escape. As the nurse pushed her, the trapped girl was forced to start down a swaying, flimsy wooden ladder into the dark, damp hole. Down, 10 or 12 feet, Nancy went until she could feel the slimy bottom under her feet. Ew! I have something against slime. This is worse than I bargained for, she thought ruefully. You think? The ladder was jerked up, and Thorne called, Don't worry, you may have it back. There was a series of splitting noises, and pieces of the ladder came running down around Nancy's head. As she threw up her arms to protect herself, she heard Thorne laugh sardonically. Then the lid clanged shut. Okay, this is another dun-dun-dun moment. Let me do this correctly. Dun, dun, dun! Nancy's locked in a well. Chapter 19. Caught. So, question is, how does Nancy get out of the well? Despair filled Nancy's heart, and she shivered. The dampness of the old cistern covered her like a clammy hand. She took a deep breath. Come on now, Nancy scolded herself. Brace up and try to find a way out. Stretching her arms wide, Nancy could feel nothing, so she knew her prison was wider than its 3-foot lid. When her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, she noticed tiny gleams of light coming from above. Perhaps the lid did not fit tightly. Or maybe it's a phosphorescent glow from some decaying thing, Nancy thought with distaste. Whatever it is, I must find out. Balancing herself with outstretched arms, she walked cautiously across the slippery floor. It was uneven, and Nancy stepped ankle-deep in cold water. A moment later, her fingers brushed this moist stone wall. She stared upward and saw light coming through chinks in the wall directly above her. I must try to reach those openings, but how? Then Nancy remembered the pieces of ladder Thorne had mockingly thrown to her. Now here's my thing. How am I supposed to get her out? So he had the ladder broken, but they still are going to have to get her out if they're going to try to ransom her, right? Maybe I can use them after all, she thought. Repressing a shudder, Nancy slid her fingers over the slimy floor for the fragments. Ew! Now's no time to be squeamish. You're right, but I'm still going to be squeamish. Finding a piece of wood, Nancy fingered it anxiously for a nail. Feeling one, she pulled it loose from the rotted wood and noted that it was long and strong. Maybe this will work, and maybe it won't, she said half aloud. To her horror, she was answered by a throaty chuckle. Nancy gasped. As the sound was repeated, she dropped the nail unnerved. Then, fighting for control, the desperate girl located the noise. It was coming from above. Was someone watching through the chinks? Calico! As the new noise blended with the chuckles, Nancy suddenly grinned in relief. Pigeons! The light must be coming from the loft. Frantically, she sought the lost nail. Locating it, Nancy began to dig vigorously at the loose mortar. Soon she had hollowed out space enough to give herself one toehold. A little farther above, Nancy dug again and repeated the process until she could reach no higher on the wall. and she climbed up and chipped out another hold. The mortar was hard, and her fingers clutching the nail grew cramped. The higher she went, the more difficult the task became. Finally, the imprisoned girl was forced to cling to the damp wall, her toes and fingers of one hand digging into the niches she had scooped out. With her free hand, she scraped a higher grip for herself. At last, Nancy's fingers found the openings through which the light filtered. A big stone rocked under her hand. So basically, Thorn helped her out, even though he was trying to be mocking. Don't give people the tools to get out, people. Although I don't know, it worked because she could scrape out the mortar. So I don't know if she would, if the mortar had been not easy to scrape out. I think she will still be stuck, but whatever. At last, Nancy's fingers found the opening. No, I read that. Mingled excitement and alarm shot through her. Here was the way out. But suppose I can't move the stone or I fall, she thought. You want to think about this now? Nancy, don't think pessimistically when you've gotten this far. About 8 feet below was the stone floor of the cistern. Nevertheless, Nancy forced herself to try pushing the stone aside. She failed, but suddenly it came loose and fell inward over her head. As the stone plummeted down, it grazed her shoulder, but Nancy managed to grab the top edge of the hole and hold tight. Ow, that's gonna be sore. With a sigh of relief, she pulled herself through the enlarged opening and up to freedom. On the earthen floor of the pigeon loft, the young sleuth fell back exhausted and closed her eyes. A few moments later, she opened them to the sound of fluttering wings and sleepy cooing. The loft was lighted by a large bright bulb under a small cage containing a pigeon. This is the sick bird, Nancy conjectured, and it is being kept warm. Capsules for messages lay on a shelf. Good, Nancy thought. She took a pencil and small pad from her blouse pocket and wrote 3 identical messages. SP at once. Nancy inserted them in the capsules, then caught a pigeon and attached the capsule to its anklet. Quickly she caught another bird, then a third. I'd better turn out the light for a few minutes so I won't be seen releasing these pigeons, she decided, and unscrewed the bulb. Nancy now felt her way to the door, opened it, and released the birds. Fly straight to Ned, she muttered. He's waiting at the Tooker estate. Hoping no one had seen the light go off, Nancy turned the bulb on again and fled from the coop to the carriage house garage. Here she considered her next move. Nancy knew there must be lights on the landing field because the gang used their plane at night. But how did they turn them on? Perhaps at a switchbox in here? She opened the door wide enough to squeeze through and saw 2 large sedans. One was the old car used to kidnap Dr. Spire. Walking past it, Nancy glimpsed inside and stopped short. She had glimpsed a white blur. Was it a face she saw? Nancy turned quietly and stepped nearer. As she stared, a figure in one corner of the back seat moved. Someone was seated there, bound and gagged. Quickly, Nancy opened the car door. Removing the gag, she asked, Morgan, how did you get here? Seriously, Nancy? Seriously? He's bound and gagged? How else do you think he got there? They brought me down, he said hoarsely. Thorn's going to finish me off to keep me from talking, but they'll do it where no one will find me. He breathed heavily. The gang's ready to escape. Tooker has given the signal to clear out. How soon? Asked Nancy as she quickly worked at his bonds. I don't know, he whispered. Soon. What about the patients? They'll herd him into the cellar. Anger gave the weakened man strength to continue. The gang isn't worried about them. I figure the shock will kill some of the old ladies and the rest will be too confused and terrified to be much help to the police. Those men are brutes, Nancy exclaimed. They mustn't get away. Quickly she climbed from the car and took the nail from her pocket. Nancy inserted it into a tire valve, holding it open until all the air had hissed out. She did the same to the rest of the tires on both cars, then hurried back to Morgan. Do you know how they turn on the landing field lights? She asked. Big oak, he said weakly, at the edge of the field. Switchbox nailed to the tree. I must turn them on, she said. I'll be back. Nancy dashed from the carriage house and ran down the hill toward the level field at the bottom. The moon was coming up, and the sloping lawn was bathed in pale light. If only they don't see me. From somewhere behind Nancy came the deep-throated bark of the Great Dane. Was he loose on the ground, she wondered? At one end of the landing field, Nancy could see the plane and at the other a clump of trees. She angled left and pounded down toward them. Reaching the shadow of the trees, she stopped and tried to spot the oak. Again she heard the dog's bark, this time closer. Nancy looked back. The huge beast was silhouetted on the brow of the hill, straining against a leash held by the gatekeeper. He began pulling the man down the slope. Does he scent me? Well, Nancy, you were kind of in some slime, so maybe? Nancy tried not to think about it and pressed deep into the clump of trees. There was the oak, and gleaming in the moonlight, a metal box nailed to the trunk. Nancy darted to it, opened the door, and pulled a single switch inside. Out on the field, spots of light were coming up through the short grass. Clever, she thought. They're sunk in the earth and aren't noticeable in daylight. Now for the plane. The far side of the landing area was bordered by woodland. Nancy ran from her shelter to the woods and hastened along the edge of the field, keeping within the tree line. At the far end, she crouched low, dashing across the clearing, and crept under the low wing of the small plane. Nancy knew that the field drains were on the underside of the wings. She felt along the surface until her fingers encountered a T-shaped metal valve. This must be it, she decided, and pressed upward. A stream of fuel flowed to the ground. Nancy found that by turning the valve slightly, she could lock it open. Then she hurried to the other wing and did the same herself. Now, Nancy said to herself, that should ground the gang. I'll get back to Morgan and hide him before the men go to the cars. As she started to move, however, Nancy heard the Great Dane growling. Coming down the field were the dog and the gatekeeper, with 4 men running behind them. Nancy recognized Thorn, Belle, and Luther, but the 4th was a tall stranger. As they drew nearer, she saw he had a gaunt, cruel face and guessed he was Adolf Tooker. I'm telling you, I didn't turn on the lights, came Luther's voice. Well, somebody did, Thorn growled. Jones, can't you shut that dog up? There's a prowler down here, replied the legit gateman. That's what's the matter with him. As the party reached the plane, they stopped less than 30 feet from Nancy. The dog strained toward her hiding place, whining. Nancy took a deep breath. I'm really in a tight spot, she thought. If she moved from the shadow of the plane's wing, the men would see her. If she didn't, the dog would attack her. Suddenly shouts came from the hillside, and Nancy saw the bobbing rays of flashlights. Wait for me, called Miss Tyson. Something's gone wrong, her shrill voice warned. The tall man said sharply, Jones, take that dog and find out what the trouble is. We'll search down here for the prowler. As the gatekeeper pulled the dog away, louder shouts came from the hillside, and the 4 men looked up toward the moving lights. It's now or never, Nancy thought, crouching low. She ran out on the moonlit field. Now we are at the final chapter, chapter 20. The SP. Not daring to look back, Nancy raced for the shelter of the woods, wondering if she could make it before being detected. Suddenly she heard a hoarse shout, Look, Chief, there goes a girl! The young sleuth's heart sank. Catch her, Thorn yelled. No, you fool, barked Belle. We haven't time. Into the plane, everybody. Go ahead, Adolf. Wait, came the tall man's hard voice. I smell gasoline. Thorn gave an angry exclamation, and Belle said, I do too. Where's it coming from? There's probably a leak in one of the fuel tanks, said Luther. Quickly, he ducked under the wing. One drain valve is open, he shouted. What? Thundered Belle. Who did that? At once Thorn climbed into the plane. In a moment he gave an angry yell. We have no fuel, he cried and jumped out. The gauges read empty. Miss Tyson raced up to them with 3 men and a girl at her heels, followed by the gatekeeper and his barking dog. Everything's gone wrong, she exclaimed. At that moment, a plane swooped soundlessly out of the sky. Before it taxied to a full stop, several armed state police officers jumped out and surrounded the criminals. A powerful searchlight was turned on the confused gang. A voice over a loudspeaker ordered, Stand where you are! No one move! Ned! Nancy cried out. She raced from the woods and reached the plane as he leaped from it, followed by Dave, her father, and the pilot. Dad! Nancy exclaimed as Carson Drew caught her up in his arms. Are you hurt? He asked quickly. No, Dad, but I'm so glad to see you. Ned, you're just wonderful. Oh, Nancy, you take such chances, he said, but I was sure happy I could come to the rescue. In a moment, a second noiseless plane skimmed down onto the field. Out jumped Bert, Lieutenant Mulligan, and 2 members of his detective squad. They joined the others in the circle of light, where the officers began snapping handcuffs on the prisoners. Miss Drew, Lieutenant Mulligan said, Ned Nickerson informed me of your plan, and I called the state police. I'm glad the mystery is solved, Lieutenant, said Nancy, then turned to Thorn. Where are the old ladies? She asked anxiously. The gang members had been sputtering at Nancy in disbelief. You! Thorne sputtered. How did you get out of the cistern? First, answer my questions, Nancy. They're in the cellar, Belle replied shortly. Miss Tyson spoke up. They're not in the cellar. As Belle looked at her puzzled, she added, I didn't have time to put them there. As soon as I saw the air was out of our car tires, I knew something had gone wrong with the plans. I wanted to get away. Fast. What did you do with Morgan? Nancy asked quickly. Nothing. He's still in the car. Nancy explained Morgan's condition to the police, who promised that the houseman would be taken to a hospital. Thorne glared at Nancy. How did you get out of the cistern? Climbed out, Nancy said directly. I used the ladder you gave me. Such a good taunt. Now she's going to sit there confused. Miss Tyson gasped. That's impossible. Briefly, Nancy told how she had escaped and sent for help. SP at once, Ned said with a grin. Sailplane at once. Also send police, Nancy added. Those aren't gliders? Tucker asked. No, Ned answered. They're motorized sailplanes. They were perfect for this job because we flew them here using the motor, then cut it out and landed soundlessly. He grinned at Dave. All we had to do was find 2 sailplanes. We finally rented these from an airport in the next county. The state police provided the pilots. Dad, said Nancy, how did you hear about the plan? Ned briefed me. He called our house on the chance that I returned from Chicago. Looking at Adam Thorne, Mr. Drew added, I'm proud of my daughter, Thorne. She planned to take you and your accomplices by surprise so you couldn't harm the old ladies before you bolted. Lieutenant Mulligan cleared his throat. Miss Drew, you're a fine detective. Yes, she is. Nancy smiled and thanked him. Adolf Tucker turned to Belle and said angrily, This is the girl you said you would be no trouble? I warned Belle about her, Thorne spoke up, but he wouldn't listen. It's not my fault, said Belle, his voice rising nervously. It's Thorne's. Ever since he read about the coroner's jeweled crystal collection, he wanted to steal it, and he dragged us into the scheme and bungled it. My men were doing all his work. Whenever I wanted Tara Jackson, they were trailing Nancy Drew in the sedan or spying on that Sylvan Lake place. They even sent the dog on her. Twice they snatched Morgan, and Jackson showed the blue fire night after night to scare him. It finally worked, and suddenly Morgan wouldn't go along with us, so we had to teach him a lesson. As for Tar, Belle went on bitterly, he spent days making the firework wheel and rigging up an asbestos-lined box for it. Ew, asbestos? Really? Tar gave a sickly grin. All I had to do was shut the door of the box and the blue fire was gone, like magic. Jackson's face was pale. We only did what Thorne ordered. Be quiet, all of you, barked Thorne. Don't you know there are police listening? It doesn't matter, Adolf Tucker said weirdly. They'll find all the evidence they need here. Is this your whole gang? Mulligan asked sharply. Tucker looked around the group, which included the gateman with the dog, the pigeon keeper, and the nurse's aide, whom Nancy had startled in the hall. Yes. Miss Tyson's assistant was shaking with fright. I was only doing what Dr. Bell ordered. He told me the patients were too nervous to have visitors. He's no doctor, Nancy told her, and I find it hard to believe Miss Tyson is a real nurse. The hard-faced woman shot her a venomous look. What? It's true. The police will find out about them all, Lieutenant Milligan said grimly. At that moment, 2 helicopters appeared, lights flashing. They landed on the field and the rotors were silenced. Last stage of Nancy's plan, and said reinforcements. Okay, called a state police officer to the arriving troopers. Load this gang in the copters and take them away. An hour later, Nancy had the biggest thrill of the evening. As she walked into the coroner's living room with her father and the boys, she saw Mrs. Eldridge seated in a big chair with little Maurice asleep on her lap. At one side stood the child's mother, on the other a tall stranger. Nancy, the old woman said happily, this is my nephew John. Nancy Drew is the girl who... Tears filled her eyes and she could not go on. Yes, he said, Nancy Drew has done a wonderful job. Thank you, Nancy. The hospital called, to Mrs. Corning. Morgan will be all right. We're so grateful to you for clearing up the mystery about him. Will you take him back? Bess asked. Of course. He is honest and faithful. We know his true story. There can't be any more trouble. Well, you know what? Good for you, Mrs. Corning. Nancy thanked her friends for helping her. She gave Bess and George each a squeeze and quickly excused herself to change her clothes. When she came downstairs, Mrs. Corning had a tray of tempting food waiting. "Oh, good," said Nancy. "Supper was a long time ago. I'm famished." While everyone ate, Mrs. Eldridge told what she had learned while a prisoner at Larkspur Lane. Tooker, whose real name was von Hofwitz, was an international confidence man. Sanatorium was his idea, she said. He made Bell a partner, and he was to pass as a doctor. Thorne had put money into the venture while in prison. As soon as he escaped, he joined the others. Mrs. Eldridge went on to say that von Hofwitz ingratiated himself into various social circles. He would introduce the fake doctor to wealthy ladies who complained of old age. "I see now how silly I was," Mrs. Eldridge said. "I was taken in by their suave manners and my own vanity." She revealed that the unscrupulous pair would persuade the women to go secretly to the sanatorium. There, using drugs and threats, Bell prevailed upon the patients to sign away large parts of their wealth to him. Mr. Drew spoke up. Thorne is a very sharp lawyer, and no doubt the contracts he drew for you women to sign seemed harmless enough, but could not be changed, even if your relatives tried to break them. But your courage, Mrs. Eldridge, said Nancy, helped to put an end to the whole scheme. There are 2 questions I hope you can answer, she added. Why did the gang use bluebells in the code? Because Bell was so conceited he wanted his own name in it. Blue, of course, was the color of the flowers growing so profusely around the estate. And why was the pigeon released from the plane? Tooker was flying from the mansion to an appointment with an old woman in Pennsylvania that day. He let the bird go on the way so that it would reach this estate more quickly. Thank you, Mrs. Eldridge, for the answers to my questions, Nancy said. And now I'll go upstairs and get your bracelet for you. So, hold on. So Belle, being so conceited, was like, I have to have my name as a password. Okay. No, dear, said the old lady. I want you to keep it as a memento. How wonderful, Nancy hugged her. Mr. Corning spoke up. And I'm going to order French crystal earrings in the form of tiny larkspurs for you and the other girls. Oh, how exciting! Bess exclaimed. Thank you very much. George grinned and added her thanks. Nancy protested that she wanted no reward. I'm just happy everything turned out right. Ned grinned. If I were to give Nancy the reward she liked best, I'd hand her another mystery to solve. But it was not Ned who would bring the clue of the broken locket, that's the book next, to Nancy, though he was to play a part in the strange case. I'll find you a mystery by tomorrow morning, he promised jokingly. And I'll be ready for it, Nancy said with a twinkle in her eyes, but make it very, very complicated and original. And that is the end of Password to Larkspur Lane. So for those who are not familiar, the books do, when the book ends, it will actually make a reference to the next book. So yes, the next book will be The Clue of the Broken Locket. And I think I have an idea what that one's about, but it's been a while, so I will let you know when we start reading it. And we will start reading it, I'll start reading it. A video on Twitch should be up Friday, and then on YouTube it should be ready on Sunday. But I am sorry that this came out late. I should be on a more regular schedule. I am kind of sick, so yeah, there's that. But otherwise, there shouldn't be anything getting in the way. But I hope you guys enjoyed this mystery. Compared to the previous 9, this is actually, I think, the most action-packed Nancy, one of the few stories that Nancy is actually the most action-packed compared to books 1 through 9. Although, number 1, I didn't realize that there was something going on in Secret of the Old Clock. I won't spoil but when I do read Secret of the Old Clock, you will know what I mean. Like, there was something that I did not expect in that one, but yeah, I hope you guys really enjoyed this one, and tune in Sunday. Hopefully we'll be up on Sunday for the first part of The Clue of the Broken Locket, book number 11 in the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories. Woo! But that's for the people on YouTube. The people on Twitch, it should be up Friday. But anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you wonderful people next time.